In the Czech Republic, in a small town, there lived a girl named Radka. Her father lost his job and couldn't get anywhere. Hard times came for her family, and they had to sell the apartment. They moved to Prague and began to rent housing there in an old, dilapidated building. Radka was sad to say goodbye to all her friends at school, but she promised that she would try to keep in touch with them. The girl did not like the noise and bustle of the new city in which she had to live. People seemed somehow unfriendly, and there were no children of her age in her house with whom she could be friends. When the summer came to an end, Radka began to grieve that her life was not going the way she would like. Her parents began to reassure her, saying that everything would get better when she went to school. But the girl wasn't so sure. On the first day at school, Radka hoped that she would make friends with new guys, but her classmates turned out to be very unfriendly. When she tried to talk to them, they just turned away from her and walked away. When she asked to play with them, they wouldn't accept her into their games. As the days passed, her classmates began openly mocking the girl. They constantly teased her, making fun of her hairstyle, clothes, and rustic accent. They told her that she looked like a rat and began to tease her with a rat. The girl tried to tell her parents that she was being bullied at school, but they were too busy earning money to be distracted by such trifles. Bullying at school became more and more unbearable, and Radka simply did not know what to do. Some kids kicked and teased her, others slapped her on the back of the head and took her lunches. But even more terrible were their evil jokes. They tore up her textbooks and painted her locker. While at school, she tried to avoid her classmates most of the time. One day, the girl couldn't take it anymore. Her classmates dragged her to the river, which flowed near the school, and threw her into the water. When Radka was sitting in the school toilet and trying to dry her clothes, a plan was born in Radka's head. By the end of the day, she decided to take revenge on all the children who tormented her at school. Returning home that evening, she found a dead rat on the side of the road. She picked it up and brought it home. At home, until her parents returned home, she turned the rat in a meat grinder, making minced meat out of it, and fried it in a frying pan. It stank terribly, so Radka added a lot of seasonings and spices to the dish. When this disgusting dish was ready, she put it in a plastic container and stuffed it into her briefcase. The next day, at school, Radka was waiting for lunch to carry out her insidious plan. When the bell rang, she took her lunch, went into the school cafeteria and sat down at one of the tables. She took out the fried rat meat, put it on the table in front of her, and waited. Soon, two girls came up to her, began to tease her and call her names. They took her lunch away from her and passed it around in the dining room. Everyone took a bite. All her classmates laughed at her and called her names, Rat. Rat. An hour later, her classmates began to feel sick. One by one, the children got up from their seats and ran to the toilet. The teacher couldn't understand what was going on. Radka also ran to the toilet to look at the result of her work. All the stalls in the toilet were occupied, and Radka could hear the sounds of vomiting and diarrhea. The air was filled with the sickening smell of diarrhea and vomiting. Some of the girls had their hands to their mouths, waiting for their turn at the booth. Others could no longer wait, and vomited right into the sink. When there were no free sinks left, one of the girls threw up right on the girl who was pooping in the sink. A real crush began in the toilet. Radka smiled with satisfaction. The next morning, her classmates realized what was the matter. During the lessons, she saw that her classmates were looking at her with hatred. She understood that it was only a matter of time before they would take revenge on her. During the lunch break, two girls approached Radka. Radka thought that they would start beating her, but on the contrary, they began to apologize to her. "We are very sorry that we treated you this way," they said. "We'd like to make friends with you." The girls said that her classmates were waiting for her in class to apologize to her. Despite the fact that Radka was a cautious girl, she waited so long for her to be treated well that she abandoned all precautions and went after them. But when they passed the basement door, the girls grabbed her. One of them held Radka tightly, and the other opened the basement door. Radka tried to resist, but it was useless. She was pushed into the basement. Radka fell down the stairs and landed on the cold concrete floor. She heard the doors slam shut and the key turn in the lock. The basement was at the back of the school. No matter how loudly Radka screamed, no one would have heard her. Lying on the floor of a dirty basement, Radka began to cry bitterly. She started looking for another way out, but the windows were too high and she couldn't reach them. She was trapped like a rat in a cage. In complete frustration, she started kicking the walls. Hitting one of the walls, she broke through the plaster. Radka began to widen the hole until a large enough passage was formed in the wall to crawl through. Radka looked inside and saw that there were no water pipes and electrical wires. For unknown reasons, a small gap was made between the inner wall of the basement and the outer wall of the building. The gap was very narrow, it went to the left and turned to the right, but it was wide enough for her to squeeze through there. Radka decided that this was the only way for her to get out of the basement, and went down the narrow passage. She walked for a long time, the darkness was pitch black, she began to be afraid that she would not get out, but soon, a narrow ray of light loomed ahead, making its way through the crack, and widened it. Looking through the crack, she realized that she was next to the principal's office. She saw the director sitting at the table, unaware that he was being watched. The director didn't do anything, he just sat at the table, staring at one point. Then he started picking his nose with his finger and eating boogers. Ugh! Disgusting! Radka thought, grinned to herself, and began to move on. She reached the other crack and scratched it. Looking inside, she saw a geography teacher and a history teacher kissing passionately, embracing each other. Wow! They're having an affair. Radka thought. Moving on, Radka found that the passage began to lead upwards. In some places it became almost vertical, and she spent all her strength to continue on her way. Eventually, she reached another tiny point of light. She looked through a small hole, it took her a while for her eyes to get used to the light. When her vision cleared, she realized that she was in the toilet. She saw the English teacher sitting on the toilet, then there was a loud splash. Disgusting, she thought. She continued on her way, confident that she would soon find a way out. The passage became narrower and lower. Continuing to squeeze between the walls, Radka had to get down on the ground and crawl. Finally, she reached a place where the passage turned slightly, forming a small corner. She tried to squeeze into the narrow space. The head and shoulders squeezed through without any problems, but the pelvis got stuck. She tried to squeeze through with all her might, but she couldn't do anything. The passage was too small. However, when she tried to return, she realized that she couldn't move an inch. Her ass is tightly stuck between the concrete blocks. In desperation, she twitched, trying to escape, but it was useless. Her worst fears had come true. I can't believe it, Radka said. I'm stuck. She began to panic and it seemed to her that she could not breathe. Is she really stuck here forever? She asked herself. The girl rested for several minutes, trying to calm down and put her thoughts in order. She started thinking about mom and dad, and that she might never see them again. Her eyes filled with tears. "Help! Help!" she screamed again and again, but no one answered her screams. Suddenly, Radka felt something touch her leg. There was a strange, musty smell in the air. She put her hand down and felt the touch of soft, warm wool. As her fingers closed around the long, fleshy tail, she screamed. Rats! Several rats climbed onto Radka at once. They climbed onto Radka, almost on her head, their sharp paws digging into her skin. Radka panicked and felt something bite her ear. Radka began desperately throwing the rats aside, defending herself from them. One of the rats started gnawing on her toes, and she kicked her with all her might. Screams of terror rang out in the dark passage, but no one heard them. For several hours she fought off hordes of hungry rodents. Every time she thought the rats had retreated, they attacked again. Her neck was stiff and her whole body ached. There seemed to be no hope of salvation. Exhausted from the terrible pain, Radka reached out and grabbed one of the rats. Enraged, she strangled the rat with one hand and put its corpse under her head like a pillow. The other rats retreated to their hiding places. It looks like they were scared. Radka lay in a narrow hole for 3 days, being on the verge between life and death. Sometimes she managed to fall asleep for a few minutes. Whenever the rats got too close, she killed one of them with her bare hands and threw the carcass to her comrades. She had to go both small and big right there. Lying in a puddle of her own urine and feces, Radka lost all hope of salvation. "I wish I could die soon," thought the poor girl. A terrible smell filled the narrow passage. Radka was very hungry and dying of thirst. She was willing to do anything for one sip of water. One rat came too close to her, and when Radka grabbed it, she brought it to her mouth and bit into it with her teeth. She started drinking rat blood. But the blood of one rat was not enough. A month later, Radka was still in the narrow passage. She managed to survive by catching rats, feeding on their corpses and drinking blood from them. She was terribly bored and her only entertainment was listening to the rats squeak. There came a moment when it seemed to her that she understood their language. Once, when Radka woke up, she tried to escape again. She was so emaciated that she finally moved. She crawled further down the corridor until she reached the desired ray of light that burned her eyes. Radka's teacher was standing in front of the class, and her classmates were sitting at their desks. Suddenly, they heard something banging on the back wall of the auditorium. The plaster crumbled and the bricks flew apart. A pair of fists appeared from a hole in the wall. With their mouths agape, her classmates Radka saw something dirty and smelly come out of the wall. It stank like 100 toilets. Something crawled across the floor, and everyone realized that it was a little girl. Her face was covered with dried blood, and her clothes were smeared with shit and urine. Everyone started screaming in horror. At that moment, a whole horde of rats poured out of the hole in a stream. They started attacking children. "Kill them all!" Radka shouted, pouncing on one girl and grabbing her by the hand. Crazed with hunger, she bit into her hand and began to drink her blood. The girls screamed in horror and pain. The teacher ran up to them and tried to save the girl. Radka pounced on him and began to gnaw his leg. The children screamed and cried, and the rats literally swarmed over them. Rodents scurried back and forth, scratching and biting everyone. No one could escape. Sharp rat teeth bit into everything they came across: arms, legs, necks. The real pandemonium began. A few minutes later, when the police arrived, it was all over. They found the walls, floor, and ceiling of the classroom smeared with blood. The remains of the children were scattered all over the room. In the center of all this chaos, a little girl was sitting on the floor and gnawing on the teacher's corpse.